Makes sense. So in a little bit, we're going to switch to questions from the audience. So if folks want to start putting in, I think in the chat, their questions, I can start to read some of them out loud in about 10 or so minutes. And if that's not right, OPC will correct me. But one thing I wanted to ask everyone is about managing readers' expectations with climate coverage. So I think two of the challenges can be one, how to surprise readers, because climate change is basically a linear process. Maybe there's some new paper today suggesting maybe it breaks the trend, but it's like a very slow moving and consistent process. There's moments when we see the extreme weather impacts, but it's not like it's not as volatile as a change as other subjects, like a war that breaks out. So how do we keep it surprising? And then also, how do we keep it from being just a constant downer? And so I love folks' thoughts on that.
So I have thoughts. The change from the downer perspective, I have a rule generally, which is if nobody's dying in your story, then it's okay to use humor. Like you want to propel the reader through. I'm trying to, I did a story, this is a very long time ago, and it was about, interestingly enough, like climate misinformation. It was a story about, there was a belief at the time that sea level rise wasn't actually rising, because when you look at a graph of sea level rise, it doesn't do this, it does, there's like, and so people were weaponizing kind of a small decline to like kind of spread this misinformation that it wasn't happening. But I didn't open the story with people are spreading that. I opened the story with this bank robber who had put lemon juice on his face because he thought it made it invisible to cameras. And then robbed a bank. And then when the cops came, because they knew who he was, he said, but I wore the juice. And the idea was, I'm going to disarm you at the beginning. I'm going to make you laugh at this like clearly unhinged anecdote, because most sane people will realize that putting lemon juice on your face does not make you invisible to a camera. And then kind of get into the misinformation, right? So that like, I'm already at that point, you're laughing, you're disarmed. You're not, if you believe the misinformation, you're not on guard to be told that I'm essentially telling you that you're dumb, right? Like you're more receptive to the message. So there's that element, which is like, you can use humor, you can use really evocative details, you can use just like wordplay. There are all sorts of things that you can do that are kind of just traditional writing and journalism techniques to keep the reader engaged. On the other side, yes, on the one hand, there are these dramatic shifts in climate science happening all of the time, but they're all like fun and unique details and aspects of climate change, or not fun, but like interesting or unique details or aspects of climate change that many people aren't aware of. And so there is still kind of perpetual novelty or new information that you can give readers or listeners or context. And maybe it's not as big or as massive as a war breaking out, but I feel like that actually works in your favor, because people sometimes need a little bit of reprieve. So if you are opening with a little bit of humor, if you're giving someone a little bit of a surprise, then they're more receptive and more willing to read your story than if you're just opening up with like millions of people will die, right? Like that is something that like, I often feel like with climate stories, it feels like taking your medicine, and we want it to feel different than that. We want people to want to read your story as opposed to feeling obligated to read your story so that they're well informed.
And I thought I'll mention, and again, it's a little tough because again, you just end up talking about the journalism that you've helped produce, but I guess that's okay. So now I can brag about Shannon Osaka, because when we're doing our series on climate change and human health, the human limit, she came to me and said, look, I think that there's this really interesting intersection between people with schizophrenia and how vulnerable they are to extreme heat. And this was something that, again, is really just emerging in the scientific literature. It's being documented in real time. The, kind of public health officials, while they recognize this is an issue, have not really come up with have not come up with a way to respond, in their planning to it. And to me, like that, so I think, and I totally, all props to Kendra for using humor, which I think is really important. I think, there are ways that you can take things that are sort of dark, in this case, chronicling what happened to, a man in his 20s, with who had schizophrenia and who was navigating the extreme heat in July, and really just share something kind of so surprising that we hadn't focused on, as a country, that it really makes you look at this issue in a new way. And I think that's another way where we can engage people. And one of the things that I think was really amazing after it published was the people who reached out, both within our newsroom and outside, who have family members with schizophrenia, who talked about how it empowered them and made them both feel like they had been seen, and also gave them a sense of what they needed to do to protect people that they loved. And to me, that was just one of those moments that really shows you how this journalism can matter.
I share a lot of what Kendra and Juliet said. I think for me, answering those questions are a couple of things. Like, one, the stories really have to be about people. I say this sometimes. I think some of the mistakes of climate journalism, 10 years ago, we'll say, was that it's too focused on the science and not enough, on the people. Not just people having, impacts, but just people as characters, whether they're scientists, whether they're, people running startups. Everybody is a person, and as people, we're endlessly fascinated with others. So I think the more that we can stay on people is really helpful. And then also try to see stories as crossover stories, right? Of things that don't just involve climate change, but involve lots of other issues, I think help make stories resonate. I think of, like, this week, we published a few stories from Navajo Nation looking at the changes in raising of sheep, which is, a central part of Navajo culture. And climate is a piece of that, but it's only a piece of it. I mean, there are other things too, generational changes and the way that the land's being managed. But for those stories, we really focused on characters, and characters who would say, surprising things. And this one sheep herder we interviewed, and was the central part of, like, this whole second story. She says at the end, like, recounting, like, how sheep help them, like, really feel, kind of at peace. How at one point a sheep sneezed all over her, and, like, it made her happy. So stuff like that. It's just like these great anecdotes. So that is a way, I think, that we approach it. We also try to look at sustainability stories in ways that cross over lots of different things. We did a story a couple of months ago on Starbucks and their attempts to kind of move away from the disposable cup, both plastic and paper. And that's a story that it's a sustainability story, and by extension a climate story, but it's also a business story and a marketing story, because that icon is recognizable worldwide. And so if you move away from the disposable cup, then, what does that do to your marketing? So I guess those are the things I would say of trying to keep it so people want to actually read the stories.
Yeah, I agree with those points as very much. I think we're always looking for something that's a surprising new angle, a new way to kind of bring an issue to light, and in areas of the world where you might not expect it. I think a lot of the coverage on kind of innovation and adaptation, comes from kind of these narratives that it's Western countries in the U.S. and others who are kind of leading the way, on certain technologies and things. But I'm thinking many years ago we supported a story about a Bangladeshi man who was, using solar school boats to educate, young people who were in a flood-prone area due to climate change. And there are these areas of the world that are overlooked, but there are everyday people there, as Peter was saying, with really good kind of human stories, people we can connect with, with readers and viewers around the world, and relatable people to bring home this issue. And I'm thinking also, more recently, we worked with Erin Baker from Time Magazine, and she reported on kind of workers in Qatar during the World Cup, kind of connecting it to sports and looking at kind of what the Qataris were doing to protect those workers during that time that they were building up the stadiums and getting ready for the cup. And the story was good because it exposed kind of the realities of that jobs of what the Nepalis were going through, the health conditions. But it also kind of revealed that, interestingly enough, to Aaron, was that the Qataris were actually ahead of most of the Western world in their protection of workers. And she then turned that around and looked at how the U.S. was, using its safety standards to protect workers, and found that, in fact, the Qataris, were ahead of where the U.S. is in many ways in protecting workers from heat exposure. So yeah, it's important to keep looking, for the stories and kind of places where you might not think they're there.